Record. Yeah, we'll just get started for today. And if more folks join us, that is welcome. So feel free to continue using the chat and engaging in the chat, especially if you have questions or comments about anything I say. The way that I teach these classes is that usually I give about like a 20-minute, 30-minute transmission of just kind of the meaning of the holiday. And then happy to take questions and, hear also kind of what's coming up for you or different things that folks want to bring into the conversation as well. So thanks everyone for joining, whether this is your first class or you were here last week as well when we looked at Rosh Hashanah. We are in this time in the Hebrew calendar and the Jewish calendar that is really potent and really profound. You could argue that this is in some ways the most important time in the Jewish calendar year. So there's a lot of information and a lot of content around this. And part of the purpose of this course is to just give a little bit of a framework for how we can tap into these holidays, especially, given the lives that we live in the modern age. So first of all, just a little bit of a recap of where we are in time. Last week we celebrated Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the new year. And that whole process of, high holidays really started with the new moon of Elul, which is the month before, right? So the Jewish calendar, it goes by the moon. So it's a little bit different than, the Gregorian calendar that goes by the sun, which is August, September, right? So the Hebrew calendar, each month starts with the new moon, was actually with a sighting of the new moon. So they're slightly skewed. So Elul is the month before this month. That is basically a full month of preparation for the high holidays. Because, in Judaism, we don't just arrive to holidays, we actually prepare for them. So we don't just, are like, okay, well, this holiday, so let me go to synagogue and check it off the box. It's like, actually, I need to prepare myself internally in order to arrive in this moment of the holiday to actually understand the meaning of this holiday. So all Jewish holidays have some sort of preparation period associated with them. And for the high holidays, because it's a pretty big holidays, we have a whole month of 30 days to prepare. So the whole month of Elul, we're really doing this deep preparation work. We're singing slichot, these songs of forgivenesses. We're even blowing the shofar. We're trying to wake ourselves up from the inside to really come into this process of tshuva, this process of returning to self, this process of examination of the self, this process of basically realignment, right? If we're thinking about human life and we understand that our life is sacred and that our time here is quite limited, right? We're not going to be here forever. And sometimes that's like a stark truth for some people, because it's like we just live our lives in such mundane routine that we don't remember that one day it's all going to end, but it will. So we are in a temporal universe, meaning that there's a beginning and an end to our human body life. So this time is really here to wake us up into that knowing and to say, like, okay, given that your time is limited, like, what are you here for? And are you living for that? Are you truly embodying and living every day in what you are meant to do? And that's a big question, which is why we have a whole month of preparation. And then once we arrive to Rosh Hashanah, which we talked about last week, right? It's a beginning of the new year. So this is not just the new month, it's also the new year in Judaism. Rosh Hashanah literally means head of the year. And that's the new moon of Tishrei, which is the month after Elul. And Tishrei is also, as we talked about last week, is the 7th month in the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar starts with Nisan, which is, if we're talking about astrology's Aries, right? Aries is kind of the newborn. So that's month number 1. And that means that, where Tishrei is also Virgo, if you're into astrology, we're in the 7th month of the year, which in Judaism, 7 is a big number. It's the rest number. It's the Shabbat. It's the, taking a break from it all. So that's why Tishrei is full of holidays, right? Because we're not actually supposed to work at all this whole month. We're supposed to just be in our process. which is also so funny to me because especially, in modern America, it's like actually so many like schools start in September or works or like new beginnings start in September, which makes sense, but it's also kind of always this awkward thing. And I remember in college, it's like you sign up for school and then you're like, okay, I have to actually leave for 2 weeks because all the Jewish holidays. So there is a certain imbalance there. But with Rosh Hashanah, it marks the beginning of this period of the days of awe, right? The 10 days of awe that basically are the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So we're in the middle of it, right? Like it's like intensified process. And the days of awe are basically kind of Elul time, but a little bit more amplified. It's kind of like Elul was just, this time of practice of doing our own thing, of really getting into it. And days of awe is kind of like someone were to like wake you up in the middle of the night and be like, are you ready? So it's, a little bit more of an intensified energy. And there's 10 days of it. And, what's actually so interesting about Yom Kippur, which is a holiday that starts this Wednesday night, and it's a 25-hour holiday. It's a fast day, known as the Day of Atonement, which is, basically our whole culmination experience, both from the whole month of Elul and our experience in Rosh Hashanah and, this 10 days of awe. It all kind of culminates in this day of Yom Kippur. And what's really unique about Yom, there's many things that are unique, but in terms of just the timing, if we talk about it, Yom Kippur takes place on the 10th of Tishrei, and the 10th day of the month. And that's actually really unique. Most Jewish holidays are either on the new moon or the full moon. We don't really get a lot of other dates, minus Hanukkah. Hanukkah is kind of stretches through, like starts on the 25th, which is also kind of strange. But so it being on the 10th is really, really fascinating. And part of the reasons is that Yom Kippur marks the time when Moses came down from the mountains, the second time, actually. So, the story goes, the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt to Pharaoh, and Moses kind of came and liberated the Jewish people and took them in Exodus through the desert to receive the Torah, to receive the holy divine wisdom. And first, when they got to Mount Sinai, which is where this divine revelation happened, Moses went up for 40 days and 40 nights and received the Torah, and then came down the mountain and saw that actually the Israelites built a golden calf and were worshiping it instead of worshiping God. And, Moses and God both were very angry. So Moses shattered the tablets and had to actually go back up the mountain to repent. And this story is actually quite central to the Yom Kippur story. A lot of the prayer liturgy is actually about this going up a second time to receive the wisdom. And this is something that actually has been really touching for me, and something that I've been working with a lot in terms of thinking about liberation or thinking about freedom, or what it means to, really like disentangle ourselves from all these systems that are upon us, is that it's usually the first time it's not going to work. Like it's actually like the first time is actually set up for failure. And I think I really love it because that's, I think, what Jewish tradition teaches us, is that the first time you try to really go for your freedom, it's not going to work out, but you actually have to go a second time. And I think that this second time is actually the crux of what we are doing when we're saying tshuva, because there's something in the experience of doing it the first time and then messing up, building a golden calf, or, really going the wrong path. There's something in there that's quite necessary for humans to experience. But we can't forget that regardless of how painful that first experience was, it's like we have to return, right? This is why it's called tshuva. It's called a return, right? Because we actually went far away and now we're returning. And one of the teachings that the Talmud gives is that actually, people who have sinned, who have made mistakes and have returned from them, are actually more holy than people who have never sinned at all, who have never made any mistakes. And that's actually a very deep Jewish teaching, that there's actually something really important and fundamental in experiencing yourself making mistakes or deviating from the path. And then that choice to return is one of the most powerful things, right? So it's not just returning from a pure place, but it's actually returning from an impure place. And that's kind of one of the teachings that is built up around this time, is that do we have that courage to not just, come back once, but actually come back twice. So the 10th day of Yom Kippur kind of marks this time that Moshe came down the mountains the second time and actually came with the complete tablets that were ready to give to the Jewish people. And one of the common prayers that we say in Yom Kippur, known as the 13 attributes, which are basically the 13 attributes of God. It's a prayer that comes up many times, both in the Slichot liturgy, but also in, Rosh Hashanah, and in Yom Kippur, we say it over and over and over again. This prayer is actually directly from the story. So what happens is, when Moses goes up to the mountain the second time, Moses is like, God, listen, I know the Jewish people fucked up. Like, I know it was not a good look for us, but come on, have compassion, have repentance. Like, let's do this. We're in a covenant. Like, we're in this together. And at first, God is very angry, right? God's like, no, I want to actually just wipe off everybody. I don't want to give second chances. Like, God's very angry. And if you've read the Bible, you know that when God's anger is activated, it's time to watch out. But what ends up happening is that they have this dialogue, Moses and God. And God ends up revealing this sacred truth, this secret to Moses. And Moses is the only prophet that actually gets to receive the secret, which becomes the bedrock of our service. And God says to Moses and is like, you know what? It's true. I'm pretty angry right now. And I need you, actually, Moses, to comfort me and to soften me. And here I will teach you how to do that. So, the imagery is that God is like, you can't see my actual face, but I'll show you my back. I mean, that's the imagery in the Bible. So God turns around and shows Moses God's back, and then basically teaches Moses the 13 attributes, which is Adonai, Adonai, Erachum v'chanun, Erech hapayim v'rav chesed v'emet, Noser chesed la'alafim, Noser avon v'pesha v'chata v'nakeh, which is a prayer that we say basically chanting about the attributes of God. And we say this to soften God, which I think is such a beautiful imagery, right? And that God actually decided to teach Moses the secret of how to get back into God's heart. So Moses not only goes down with the second tablets intact, but actually also goes down with a secret prayer that God says that we can use whenever we feel like our connection with the divine is too severed, right? When we feel like there's no hope, when we feel like God's too angry, when we're too angry, when there's too much distance between us or whatever it is, we can just say this prayer and it just softens everything. And our relationship between the divine comes back into union. So I really love that story. I think it's really amazing. And I think that, the role of prayer is really profound in this, and that this becomes, as I said, like the bedrock of the Yom Kippur liturgy. And there's many different tunes for this. And for me, they're all so moving, because especially when I think about this story as the prayer is recited, it's quite profound. So in essence, this is kind of what Yom Kippur was about, right? Is about how do we as human beings meet our creator, meet the divine again, knowing that we have built a golden calf, knowing that we have worshiped things that are false idols, and knowing that we have, strayed. And when we think about that, it's not necessarily to get so critical of ourselves, but it's to actually understand the nature of what's happening. And when we think about false idols, right, it's not necessarily like building a golden calf and worshiping, although it could be, but it's, addiction patterns. Like, what are we addicted to that is not serving us, whether it's behaviors or thought patterns or relationships or ways that we engage with humanity. Or what systems of oppression are we collaborating with that are also, not supporting the life force? Like, when I think about God and I think about divinity, for me, that means uh, everlasting evolution of the life force, right? The divinity wants to live. That's the core. And in many traditions, and Judaism included, it's like the teaching is v'chai b'hem. Why do we study Torah? Why do we follow Judaism? And so that we may live by them, right? So it's all about this life force. It's how do we protect the life force and how do we allow it to renew itself all the time? And if we're honest with ourselves, we can see that we actually, a lot of us, most of us, many of us, probably, all of humanity, we actually engage in behaviors and in ideologies that are actually about killing instead about giving life. And to me, that's a really interesting metric of how we can think about our behaviors and our thoughts and all of that. Is it serving life or is it serving killing? And I say killing and I don't say death, because death is actually part of life, right? And there's an organic nature between life and death. But then there's another thing that is called violence, that is called, this murder of this life force, this murder of the divine force. And that's different than death, right? So I think that's a good frame to look at, are we actually ready for this day? This day is called the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Kippur comes from the Hebrew root kapar, which means to atone. And if you're Sephardic, maybe you have this ritual, like my dad calls me every year, and they put some, like in some traditions they take like a bird, but sometimes you just do it with money, and you just say some words and you put it over your head to just like kind of cleanse the energy. So you do the kaparot, it's called, but really you're doing this atonement. And I think someone said this about Yom Kippur kind of being this performance of death, right? It's this very interesting thing because, we say that the books of life are open. So on Rosh Hashanah, they're basically like and so you can think about this a couple of different levels. So some of you may have heard of the Akashic Library and the Akashic Records, which is basically every soul has a book that basically tells the story of its soul on earth, right? Its soul's path, and actually not just on earth, but just the soul path that the soul goes through. And there's a library where the books of all the souls are written. And every year, according to Jewish tradition, God kind of takes these books out and goes one by one and looks. It's like, okay, what is the evolution of this soul? And what has this soul done this year? And what does that mean for the future? So it's kind of this record-keeping accountability time. And this is where, things get a little bit into this realm about fate and free will. And kind of that level, it's like, to what extent do our actions impact our futures, and to what extent are we, under the divine fate? So all of these questions are kind of coming up right against each other. But God basically opens these books and looks at each soul's behavior for the last year and is like, okay, what is the fate that's going to be for this coming year? And this happens every year. So it's like, this checks and balances kind of process between us and God. But yeah, so what it says is that on Rosh Hashanah, these, after we did kind of this whole 30 days of Elul, Rosh Hashanah, the books are opened and the things are written in them. And on Yom Kippur, the books are sealed. So this is why the 10 days of awe are also quite profound, because even though things are written, they're not necessarily sealed until Yom Kippur. So we still have this time to transform ourselves. So, the whole kind of relationship between the opening of the books, the writing, and then the sealing, right, which happens at the end of Yom Kippur. Like, this is why Yom Kippur, it's like the last kind of minute where we're just like, what do we want our fate to be this year? Are we like fully ready for our fates to be sealed? And it's quite a dramatic moment in that way. And this is why it's like customary to wear white, and, the whole kind of ceremony. It's like you're supposed to be in synagogue all day praying, and it's a community, and repenting both individually but also communally, right? I think there's something so powerful about as a community saying, like, this is where we have been misaligned. Like, how do we come together, right? Like, this is part of the whole thing. And one of the teachings in Judaism, which I really love also, is that it says in the Talmud that the kind of misalignments that happen between us individually and the divine and God, Yom Kippur atones for it all. Like, Yom Kippur has the power to really atone and start a clean slate between us and the divine. But for things that have been, for conflicts that have been unresolved, or misalignments that have happened between humans and other humans, God cannot atone for that until there's been some reconciliation between the humans, right? That's actually between us, that there's a responsibility there. Of course, there's a lot of kind of matters, especially around oppression, of what that means. But I think that this teaching of just like, okay, God cannot fully forgive the ways that we treat one another, because that's on us, right? Like, that's on us to work out with each other, which is why this time is also really calling for this time of examination of communal relationships. Like, how do we treat one another, not just as individual people, but also, kind of bringing up the communal and systemic relationships that are bigger than just the personal. And I think that, that's quite an important teaching, because a lot of times we just are like, okay, maybe God will just take the reins and do everything for us. But actually, part of what it means to be human is to actually take responsibility for what it means to be human, which comes with a lot of pain and a lot of hurts, both towards each other and towards land and towards, nature and all of that. So it's really, the work is on us to really come forward and to heal together. And when we do that, of course, the divine supports us. There's this really beautiful teaching, Maimonides, Rambam, who's one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, has this whole really beautiful, in the Guide of the Perplexed, which is one of the his philosophy books. He writes about, it kind of ends with this beautiful articulation of how to reach God consciousness, or how to meet God. Which, right, and Yom Kippur is really about that. It's like, how do we really meet God? Well, part of meeting God is like removing all the blocks that are in the ways between me and God. Like, I can't really show up to God and just have a bunch of blocks, because then I'm not going to be able to see God. So a lot of why we're doing these rituals of forgiveness is to really cleanse and purify, right? Like, this whole time is about cleansing and purifying so that we can come and meet God. Like, that's actually the purpose. But yeah, so the Rambam, what he kind of shares, he articulates this whole like structure of what it means to meet God. And he uses it with imagery of the king and in the courtyard, right? So he kind of, in the palace, it's called like the palace imagery, or the metaphor. And there's 7 different levels, right? The highest one is like being like one-on-one with the king. But getting there, actually, like, there's just being a person in, the world, the same world that the king lives in, and hearing that there's a faraway king. There's the traveling to the city of the king. There's going to the courtyard of the king. There's making it through the courtyard, being in the, so there's kind of depictions of different levels. And one of the teachings that we say about Elul and Days of Awe is that, throughout the year, God kind of sits up on high in God's throne. So it's very hard to access the divine, right? Because we need to travel and we need to make it through all these protocols to meet the divine. But actually, during this time, instead of us having to come to God, God actually comes to us, right? So God leaves God's throne and comes into the courtyard to meet the people. So God is just more easily accessible than during, the other times of the year. Now, that doesn't mean that, we're just going to wake up in the middle of the night and have like an ecstatic God experience. We might, but that's not necessarily what it means. It just means that if we put in effort, it's actually going to be received much more than in other times of the year, right? There's a ripeness there. There's a more accessibility. So, like this whole kind of the king's in the court is a lot of times kind of the imagery that's kind of coming, like God's here, God's with us. So this is part of why we're trying to unfilter our eyes too. It's like, so we can see clearly, right? So that we're not deluded by our blocks that we have kind of brought up. Okay, I have a couple more things, but feel free if you have questions still like to write in the chat, and I'll definitely address them. And then we'll have time maybe in 10 more minutes for questions too. So the other thing that's quite profound about Yom Kippur is the reenaction of the temple service, which is called the Avodah service. Now, some synagogues like stopped doing it. Some synagogues have started reviving doing it. It's like a big discussion in the Jewish world. But basically what it means is that, thousands of years ago, we had our temple in Jerusalem. And what that meant is actually all of our holidays, minus, the rabbinic ones, which are Purim and Hanukkah, they actually were about having some sort of temple service, meaning not just prayers, but sacrifices, right? Sacrifices of animals, korbanot, it's called. Like, so the Kohanim, especially, I'm a Kohen, we still have this tribe, even though we don't have the temple, we've still somehow managed to kind of save these lineages. They would do this particular temple service to engage with the holiday. And particularly about Yom Kippur, right, there's a whole structure of the Jewish tribes. So there's the Israelites, which are the common people. There are the Levites, who are the singers. They would basically stand outside in the courtyard of the temple, and they would bring their trumpets, their violins, all of that. They would basically be doing the music for the people. And then there's the Kohanim, who would go into the temple and do a bunch of service. And within the Kohanim, there's also then the high priest or the high priestess. And they would actually do the most dangerous work of all, and especially on Yom Kippur, right? Like the whole year in some ways for the priestessing, it's like preparation for this moment where the high priest goes inside the Holy of Holies in the temple. So, just like in the courtyard, there's kind of all these levels. In the temple, there was all these different levels too, right? There's a courtyard, which the Levites are kind of singing around. And then there's going into the temple. And then within the temple, there's the Holy of Holies, which in the Holy of Holies, there's basically the Krovim, right? The ark that holds the Torah, but actually holds, more importantly, these two angels, these two winged angels, Cheruvim, that are looking at each other. And that's kind of in the middle of the Holy of the Holies. And actually, this is going to be another class one time, but this is actually the basis of also, what is known in some communities as like Tantra work or sexual magic work, right? Is that the core of it is this cherubim that are looking at each other, facing each other directly, and allowing for the divine force to move between them. It's about God meeting God, right? Through union. So that's actually like the cosmic force. That Judaism and many other religions throughout, especially the ancient Near East, they were practicing this. And a lot of this also comes from ancient Egypt, which of course Judaism is very heavily influenced by. So the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and basically have this moment, kind of like this one-on-one moment with Moses. Is in some ways a replication of that, where they're supposed to ask for forgiveness for the entire congregation, for the entire Jewish people, and to say, like, listen, I'm here as a spokesperson for my people, and we want to renew the covenant with you. We want to be in divine union with you. And I know these people, they're stubborn, they've done this stuff, they don't know, there's ignorance, there's all this stuff, but I'm here on behalf of the people to say, like, let's do this again, right? And a lot of so this is called the Avodah service, right? And in the liturgy, it's like basically depicting like what the priests would do. There's like a lot of outfit changes. They would first wear all yellow and then all gold, and not yellow, white, and then gold. And, they would sprinkle like water. And there was just like this whole kind of ritual that the Kohanim would do. But basically, the kind of culmination would happen when the high priest would leave the Holy of Holies back into the community. So as the high priest is kind of in the Holy of Holies, having this divine kind of experience with God, this Moses God one-on-one kind of connection around let's do this again. The way that we know that if God has forgiven the entire community is if the high priest lives, right? There's basically the high priest puts their life on the line. The high priest dies, it means bad signs for the Jewish people. The high priest lives, that means that God has received our prayers. So their life is on the line, and the whole community are basically in suspense, waiting to see like what's going to be true. Is the high priest going to be able to come out? Are they not? And when the high priest comes out, all the people kind of rejoice, and the Levites bring all their song and the dance. And this is, kind of towards the end of Yom Kippur, which is in the liturgy, there's a really beautiful song that's called Mar'eh Kohen, which is the image of the Kohen, right? It's like basically about the rejoicing that the Israelites did once they saw that the Kohen would come out in peace, and what that meant for the community. So that's part of what would happen in the Avodah service. And I will also mention that a huge part of Yom Kippur, and especially the Avodah service, is as I was saying, there's all these rituals of sprinkling water, of changing clothes, of all of this. There's also this ritual of prostrations that specifically the Kohanim did, but actually everybody did on Yom Kippur, and some congregations still do it. Not as much as what happened, but we have kind of a remembrance of it, which prostration is basically when we kneel down and we don't just little bend our knee, but we actually put our forehead to the ground. So there was actually like 7 times that the Kohen would do this. All the Kohanim would gather and they would say a specific verse, Baruch Shem Kavod Mechuto L'Olam V'Ed, like blessed God's kingdom from now until eternity. And that was a huge part of the ritual of cleansing and transformation and being connected to God again. I did an art show about all of this, specifically prostrations, that you're welcome to check out at prostrations.com, that kind of details a little bit more about this ritual, not just for Yom Kippur, but for, kind of the whole time. So yeah, let me just get through a couple more things. And so basically, the prayer, I'll just talk a little bit about, so Yom Kippur itself is a fast day, right? We're not supposed to engage in eating or drinking. It's also very common to not wear leather and not engage in sexual activity. Some people don't even talk, right? Like they are like, I'm going to take a vow of silence only for prayer, right? Like I only will speak words of prayer. I tried that one year. It's actually quite powerful. It's like a meditation retreat, except, you're just offering prayers to God. And yeah, you're not really supposed to wash yourself or anoint in lotion or kind of do anything like that. Really, the whole purpose is to cleanse and purify and just cleanse the whole body. And some people actually also have a ritual of doing mikveh, right, the day before Yom Kippur, of going into some running waters to really clear and cleanse and make sure your body is ready for the day. And the whole kind of day, there's so many prayers, right? But the evening in Yom Kippur starts with a prayer called Kol Nidrei, which is the marker of Yom Kippur, which basically, like the prayer leaders recite it a couple times, and it's this acknowledgement to say that every vow that we have made this year is nullified. Meaning that, if a few months ago I was like, by the end of the year, I'm going to complete this project, right? I said this thing and I didn't keep my word, right? Not keeping your word in Judaism is very dangerous. It's like one of the most dangerous things, because whole of Judaism is actually about the word, right? It's how do we, words are not just words are power. Words create worlds. So when I say I'm going to do something, then I don't do it, I'm actually putting myself in high risk in terms of divine accountability. So part of the reason why we start with Kol Nidrei is that we want to forgive everything we said and we didn't, fully kind of live through. we said we would do these things and we didn't, we're going to forgive all the nidarim, all these vows. So that's, the ways that we started, again, to kind of cleanse all the things that happened. And we also have a really special prayer that comes right after it that it's like latir litpalel im ha'avaryanim. It's we allow ourselves to pray with the sinners. So I think it's such an interesting thing, right? It's like we acknowledge that there's been people who have transgressed or who have done things that are not right. And for today, we're going to permit our community to pray together. I think that that's a really incredible, like, transformative justice, restorative justice model of like, what does it mean to have a prayer where you're permitting people who have harmed in your community to allow them back into the community. So it's this very like potent prayer and ritual that we do, right? Because part of Yom Kippur is that we're supposed to come as a community to God, right? We don't go as an individual, we go as a community. And then, during the day, we have a bunch of prayers that we say, and we end the day with a liturgy called Ne'ilah, which literally means closing, where we close, the gates are closing, right? That's kind of the image. It's like the books are closing, the gates are closing. It's kind of this, last kind of moment to kind of get all your prayers, all your intentions in, and before everything is kind of sealed. And lastly, it's during the afternoon, we recite the book of Jonah, which for me is a very special book. It's a book in the Bible. Jonah is one of the prophets. And his story, I definitely recommend reading it. It's only 4 chapters. It's pretty simple. And it's basically about God kind of choosing him to go announce to the city of Nineveh that their time's up, right? Like they have been engaging in not good behavior and God wants to destroy the city. And Jonah doesn't want to say this to the people. He gets really scared of his mission, so he runs away, and he runs away through Jaffa and on a boat. And I think he's headed down to Egypt because Nineveh, I think, is more modern day Iraq. And on the boat, basically, the storm comes. People realize that he is the one causing that because God's angry at him, and they throw him off the boat, and then a whale devours him for 3 days. So he sits in the belly of the whale doing his forgiveness process and his tshuva. And he actually has a prayer there that I think is really beautiful that I definitely would recommend everybody to read about, his prayer to God, basically. And then the whale spits him out. He goes to Nineveh and he sees that the people have actually done tshuva and have actually repented. So God doesn't destroy the city. And Jonah actually has quite a reaction to that because he's like, well, why'd you hire me for, right? Like, you hired me for the thing and now I can't do this thing. And I went through the whole process. So it's a really interesting story. And one year I have in the back of my folders a little booklet that I'm writing about Jonah. But yeah, so, there's a lot of connections also between that story and the work that we do in Yom Kippur. So that was a lot of content. Let me pause there and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Feel free to use a chat, or if you want, you can also unmute yourself. Yeah.
Dar, can I ask you a question to start if no one else feels
Yeah, go for it.
So it's two-pronged. I was wondering how you could speak to forgiveness and repentance with people people in societies when the relationships are not going to magically or divinely change after Yom Kippur. And so I think we can think of that, with Israel-Palestine. I think within families, conflicts and contentious relationships that can't seem to work out. What do you do to spiritually move past that if you can't practically in this day? Thanks so much.
Beautiful.
Can I just add one thing to that? I was actually, thank you, Carly. I was thinking about that sort of impossibility of achieving this reconciliation when you've been on the receiving end of abuse. Like, I survived an anti-Semitic attack at Columbia University in a department, and like, I can't, for legal reasons, see the people and I don't want to. And they've been trying to like send me signals that they're repentant in a very performative way the last year. And I've been like, no, I can't. So it's very, it's difficult for me to forgive them because I'm moving on, going on to hopefully do my PhD next year at NYU. And it's like, forgiving them is like justifying what they did to me. It's very difficult. It's very complicated. I feel like
Yeah, totally.
like a block when it comes to that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for that question. It's really, really profound and really deep. And forgiveness is one of the hardest things. I remember for me personally, I've also had my fair share of sufferings in this world, as we all, I imagine, have. And I remember I was younger and I went to one of my teachers and he taught me, he's like, just forgive these people who have harmed you. And I was like, no way, well, never. Like, I can't, like, I literally can't in my body. And I remember just like feeling like, even if I wanted to, like, I literally just can't. And that, took me maybe like 5 to 7 years to really understand what my teacher was telling me about forgiveness. Because I think forgiveness is, it's really hard. And I want to, in some ways, also invoke some of the teachings of Jesus, which are all about actually forgiveness and how central they are. And, this could be a whole course just on forgiveness because it really, so a couple of things. One, Yom Kippur is not here to say, like, make friends with your abusers or your oppressors and let's all just be together and it'll be great. Like, that's not actually the model of accountability that Judaism is going for, right?
Especially before the justice, right? That like there needs to be accountability and justice in order for there to be forward forgiveness and reconciliation. So yeah.
Totally. And, part of the frame is that, especially around these times, and, one of the things that I try to teach is that Judaism teaches that God is a God of justice, right? So like our systems, human systems, are not necessarily, as we know, like our law courts or whatever it is, they're not systems of justice, but there is justice in the divine universe, right? And for me personally, it's like putting my faith in that and knowing that that's actually true, even if I don't know the ins and outs, like knowing that there is a system of accountability that is rooted in the divine laws, that already gives me something to hook onto in my consciousness. Now, in terms of forgiveness, a lot of times it's like when we think about forgiving others, it's not necessarily like every person is going to have to do their accountability with Creator. Like every person has to do that. And that's a natural law. Now, when I decide to forgive, it's first of all, I want to kind of give the frame that it's not about the other person, it's about my relationship with myself, right? Because the other people can do whatever, but I don't allow for that experience or for whatever has happened to continue harming me, right? Because a lot of times it's like something happens or someone does something to us, whatever it may be, and then time has passed and I realize that there's an imprint in my system that actually like still activates me. And I actually, like, at that point, even though that might have happened years ago, and even though it probably was that person's responsibility, because I'm holding the imprint of that, I actually can now choose to let it go and I can choose to heal it. So it's actually not about this other person doing anything different, but it's actually about me choosing to not allow for that to actually come into my space anymore, which is, why boundaries are also a huge part of forgiveness, right? Forgiveness and boundaries are actually, like, in some ways, two sides of the same coin. When we're boundarying, we're able to actually like let go. I'm not going to be able to let go completely if the boundary isn't strong enough, because then, this universe is filled with violence. Like there's no like joking about that. There's no naive, like full of light, like, okay, full of light, but also full of violence. And we know that. So this is why we boundary and we do not allow the violence to come into our system, right? Like this is one of the hardest things to do, is to put a boundary, and we say no to violence, we say yes to the divine, right? And then we clear. So then even if there's people who are saying yes to violence, they're not in our consciousness and they're not inside of us, right? They're boundaried. So they have their own kind of deal with the creator, but I'm not allowing them into my space. Whether or not they're, obviously we can't, we can, eventually we will all like change the world together, but that doesn't necessarily mean physically it's going to resolve things, because sometimes we have to be bound, whether it's relationship to family or in work or whatever it is. But I'm talking about more starting energetically, right? Like not letting people who harm you into your divine field. And then the other thing I want to say about forgiveness is that when we think about forgiveness, what is forgiveness actually? Forgiveness is actually about choosing to reunite with the divine field, right? Because when I am, and we can think about it as self-forgiveness or forgiveness of others or whatever it is, when something happens that's in misalignment, it's going to actually become separated from the divine consciousness. And we're living in times of like incredible fragmentation throughout the world, right? We feel fragmented, we feel separate, this thing's here, that thing's there. Like there's no unified field at all, there's no coherency. But when I choose to forgive, what I'm choosing to do is that I'm choosing to put whatever thing was, and I'm putting it back into the love stream. And I can only do that if I believe that the love stream is also a stream of justice, right? Because if it's just love, then it's like, but love and justice we know are connected spiritually. So it's a radical, courageous choice, right? And it's I'm thinking again about the teachings of Jesus, because they're so profound about what it means to forgive your enemies, right? Like your enemies, they're not necessarily going to change, but you can forgive them, meaning you can realign into the divine field of love. And it's not about them, it's actually about you, and it's about God, right? Because God has sent you here for a divine purpose, and you can complete that purpose. So it's like less getting caught in their consciousness and more bringing forth the divine consciousness of what is actually meant to be here. So that's a little bit my answer. I hope that was satisfactory. There's a lot of more details I can go into that, but I'm just like, okay, this is a really deep field, and you're actually inspiring me to maybe create a certain course maybe next year about forgiveness and accountability and justice, because it's definitely heavily needed in our society.
That was so beautiful, I just want to say, and I would absolutely take that course next year.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, any other questions or comments or anything anyone wants to share?
I have a question, a little different than the theory, like more of like not practical question, but I'm curious this year to engage with like the Yom Kippur prayers or like services more spiritually, rather than usually it's like I go to services and then I have like my like they're sort of fragmented because I don't really know what's happening always in the services. And I'm just curious if you like, I appreciated how you like talked a little bit about the structure of the like with Kol Nidre and everything, of like where do these prayers or like this book actually come from, or like what's a little more of like the context of what they're like saying up there, so I can like understand it more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, so in Judaism is so ancient, it's been around for so long, and there's different strands of learning. One is Torah learning, right? Like learning the texts of the Bible, the Talmud, all of that. One is Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. That's kind of the three cores of Judaism. Torah is like the study of Torah. Gemilut Chasadim is acts of loving kindness, right? The way that and then Avodah is actually prayer, right? Which is called work in Hebrew, which I love, because what is work other than prayer? And it's a whole actually other teaching than learning the Torah. So there's learning the Torah, which is learning the Parsha, learning the weekly Torah portion, learning all of that, learning the books. And then there's learning the prayers. And, there's some, kind of like I said, with the story of Moses and all of that, it's like prayer picks up on texts from the Torah and kind of makes it an experience. That I think is in some ways what prayer is doing. Is it's trying to in some ways relive that experience, especially with what we were kind of talking about with the Moses and meeting God. But yeah, I mean, I think that, this is in some ways, I think one of the biggest pain points in Jewish community right now, is that we don't really know what prayer is. We've kind of forgotten what we're doing. So we go to synagogue and we say a bunch of words and then we still don't really know what happened. But part of it is like, so not to discourage anyone in any way, but just to say that like the liturgy canon is quite large and it takes years to really understand the full thing. So it's I would also always recommend to just like start small. Maybe it's like just starting with the 13 attributes and like really learning those and seeing like, okay, what are those actually qualities about? And maybe you can even look at the story in the Torah, because I think for me personally, I get so much from like reading the prayer and the text together and seeing, kind of what's happening there. I will also say that, experientially what prayer is supposed to be about, right? It's like, in Judaism, we have an understanding of angels, and that angels are actually in constant worship and song and prayer to God. So when we're actually engaging in prayer, we're actually connecting to this angelic field, and we're, connecting in unison with that. So it's, you might have heard different ways that quotes within Judaism and outside of Judaism, where it's like music is constantly happening. It's just a matter if we're like tapped into that. So it's kind of a little bit of that teaching. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I think my recommendation, I don't know if you have a Yom Kippur like prayer book or, even online there, you can pull some out, but I would actually just like find one text that gravitates towards you, whether it's a song, whether it's like, or even anything that I kind of shared about in this teaching, whether it's like the Kohanim, the priestess stuff. You can look at the prayer that I mentioned, Mar'eh Kohen, like the image of the Kohen, and maybe just dive into that, and or just pick one song and play it on YouTube and kind of get it into your subconscious. And usually the subconscious, it reawakens memories. So even if we don't necessarily know what we're doing when we pray, it's like our soul knows, right? Because all of our souls have been in prayer. So yeah, I think that's my recommendation. Whatever kind of resonated with what I said, whether it's like Kol Nidre, like maybe, Kol Nidre is like a paragraph long. So it's maybe just like sitting with it and reading it, and, or, getting a partner, a friend, and learning it together and seeing what's there. It's part of what I was saying about having a full month of preparation where we don't just arrive. We also like, it's kind of like that. That's how I feel about prayer too, is that, we don't just say prayers, we also learn prayers. So we learn prayers in order so we can pray, right? Like it's a connection. Yeah, I hope that was supportive. Cool. Yeah, maybe one. Mara, did you have one more thing? I think you're on mute.
No, I didn't.
Cool. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was nourishing and supportive and helped kind of bring the Yom Kippur frame. I'll send a recording out later today. And next week we'll meet for Sukkot, which is a holiday that comes after Yom Kippur. It's like we're full on with holidays, which is really, really amazing. And may everybody have a really blessed and spiritually enlightening Yom Kippur. May it meet you in whatever moment you want it to meet you at. May it meet you with a lot of grace, and may you feel full of the divine spirit, however that looks to you. So thank you so much, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Hadar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.